Oh, there are so many yummy vegetarian options out there. You could try like lentil soup, veggie burgers, tofu stir fry. The possibilities are endless. Welcome. Today we're going to tackle a really critical decision for any Canadian company that's looking to expand its operations abroad. We're talking about that moment when you need to convert a foreign branch into a full-blown foreign subsidiary. This transition is a huge step in a company's global journey, and believe me, getting the tax side of it right is absolutely essential. Okay, so here's how we're going to break this down. First, we'll set the scene with the general path of international expansion. Then we'll look at why you might start with a foreign branch. After that, we'll get into the actual conversion to a subsidiary and, crucially, understand the tax impact. We'll also explore some strategic alternatives and finish up with why foresight is so important in all of this. Let's dive in. Right, so let's start with the big picture, the international expansion path. The first thing you really have to grasp is that expanding into another country, well, it's not a one-and-done decision. It's more like a journey. And as your business grows and becomes more profitable, your company's legal structure abroad is almost certainly going to need to evolve right along with it. That brings us to our second point, starting with a foreign branch. So where do most companies begin when they decide they need boots on the ground in a new country? Well, more often than not, the answer is a foreign branch. This is usually that first big step beyond just, shipping your products out from Canada. Okay, now this next point, this is the absolute key to understanding everything else we're going to talk about. A foreign branch is not a separate company. I really want to stress that. Legally, for tax purposes, for everything, it's just an extension of the Canadian parent company. Think of it like a tentacle of the main body operating on foreign soil. It's the same legal person, just in a different place. So why would you even start with a branch? Well, for starters, it's way simpler and cheaper to set up. But the real game changer, the big reason, especially in those early startup years when you're likely losing money, is a really powerful tax advantage. Any losses that foreign branch incurs can be brought right back home and used to directly offset the taxable income of the parent company here in Canada. That's a huge benefit. Now let's talk about the conversion to a subsidiary. Because what happens when that foreign operation starts to mature? What happens when it stops losing money and actually starts turning a profit? Well, that's when the whole equation flips. Suddenly, for all sorts of reasons, legal, liability, and especially tax, it often makes a whole lot more sense to make that strategic shift from a simple branch to a full-fledged foreign subsidiary. And let's be clear, this is not just a name change. We're talking about a fundamental structural shift. The conversion means you are creating a brand new, legally separate corporation in that foreign country. So unlike the branch, which was just an extension of the parent, this new subsidiary is its own legal person. It has a distinct identity completely separate from its Canadian parent. This diagram here really lays out how that shift actually happens mechanically. You've got the Canadian parent company, which owns all the assets of the branch, right? Well, it essentially sells or transfers all those assets to this newly created foreign corporation. And because the parent company owns the shares of this new corporation, it becomes a subsidiary. That's the transaction that brings the new subsidiary into existence. And when we say assets, we're not just talking about a few desks and some computers. This transfer involves the whole shebang, everything that makes the branch a functioning business. You've got your tangible assets, inventory, equipment, buildings, but you've also got the really valuable intangible assets like goodwill, customer lists, and patents. Everything gets moved over. Which brings us to the heart of the matter, understanding the tax impact. Because this is where things get really complicated and, frankly, quite dangerous from a tax perspective. The simple act of transferring those assets can trigger a potentially massive Canadian tax bill. So here's the fundamental problem. Canadian tax law has two completely different sets of rules here. If you were transferring these assets to another Canadian corporation, you could almost always use a tax-deferred rollover. That means you transfer them at their tax cost, what they're on your books for, and poof, no immediate tax to pay. But the moment you transfer those same assets to a foreign corporation, the rules change completely. The law says you have to do it at fair market value, no exceptions. And this fair market value rule is not just some small piece of administrative red tape. It has massive implications. If the value of those assets has gone up since you first acquired them, and you hope it has because that means your business is successful, this rule forces the Canadian parent to recognize that growth as a taxable gain. It creates a tax liability out of thin air, right here, right now. Let's walk through a quick example to make this crystal clear. Say the assets of your branch have a tax cost of, let's say, $300,000, but the business has been doing great, and now they're worth $500,000 on the open market. The second you do that transfer to the new subsidiary, the CRA says, okay, you just realized a gain. You take the $500,000 fair market value, subtract the $300,000 tax cost, and bam, you have a $200,000 taxable gain in Canada. And the crazy part, not a single dollar of actual cash has changed hands. It's a paper gain that results in a very real tax bill. Okay, so now for some strategic transfer alternatives. We've established there's this big, scary tax bill looming over the whole process. The natural question is, what can we do about it? How can a smart company manage this? Well, fortunately, you're not without options. So this really becomes the key strategic question, doesn't it? If a straight-up transfer of every single asset is going to create this massive tax liability, what's the alternative? How can you get the benefits of having a subsidiary without getting hammered by an upfront tax bill? Well, here's a very common and, I think, very clever strategy. Instead of transferring every single asset, you do a selective transfer. The Canadian parent company actually holds on to the ownership of the physical assets, things like buildings and equipment. It then just leases them to the new subsidiary. And for the intangible assets, like patents and the brand name, the parent company keeps ownership of those too, and simply charges the subsidiary royalties for the right to use them. The immediate result of this retain and charge strategy is that you create a new stream of payments. Now, the foreign subsidiary is regularly sending rent and royalty payments back home to the Canadian parent company. But of course, this opens up a whole new can of worms. What do these rent and royalty payments actually mean for your bottom line? Well, for one, they shift profits out of the foreign subsidiary and back to the Canadian parent. But here's the catch. The foreign country isn't just going to let that money leave tax-free. They'll almost certainly apply a withholding tax to those payments. So to figure out if this is actually a good idea, you have to do some pretty complex math, comparing the income tax rates in both countries and factoring in those withholding taxes. And all of this really leads us to our final and maybe most important point, the importance of foresight. It's all about planning for the entire life cycle of your international business. If there's one thing to burn into your memory from this whole discussion, it's this quote right here. International reorganizations do not have the same flexibility as domestic reorganizations. It's just a different world. Those handy tax-deferred rollovers we rely on all the time for moving assets around within Canada, you can pretty much forget about them once you cross an international border. The rules are just fundamentally different. So what does this mean in practical terms? It means you can't afford to be short-sighted. You can't just pick the branch structure because it's easy today and think, oh, we'll deal with the consequences later. No. You have to be thinking about that future conversion to a subsidiary from day one and planning for the tax hit of that move before you even set up shop. And that really leaves us with one final thought to wrap this all up. Given all these complexities, how early should a company really start planning its international tax structure? The real question isn't if you should plan, but how early. And the answer is always, always before you make your first move. Because great tax planning isn't just about solving the problems you have today. It's about anticipating the ones you'll have tomorrow and building a structure that can stand the test of time as your business goes global.